October 21, 1964. Park Avenue, Manhattan. A man walks out of a restaurant into the cold night air, buttons his coat, and gets into a waiting car. He is not just any man. He is Joe Bonanno, boss of one of the 5 most powerful criminal organizations in America. A man who helped write the rules of the American underworld. So feared, so respected, so deeply embedded in the machinery of organized crime that even the other bosses handle him carefully. The car pulls away. Joe Bonanno disappears. No body, no blood, no ransom call. No witnesses. The boss of the Bonanno crime family vanishes off a Manhattan sidewalk as if the city simply swallowed him whole. For 19 months, nobody knows if he is alive or dead. Not his own family. Not the FBI. Not the 4 other most powerful crime bosses in New York City. And here is the detail that changes everything. He staged it himself. Joe Bonanno faked his own kidnapping because in the 2 years before that night, he had secretly plotted to murder 3 sitting mob bosses simultaneously. At dinner, on the same night, one of them was his own cousin. The commission found out. They stripped his family. They summoned him to a tribunal that everyone understood meant one thing: death. His answer was to vanish. What followed was 6 years of civil war. A Senate hearing that exposed every secret the American Mafia had spent 30 years protecting. And the complete destruction of an empire one man's ego built over 3 decades. The Godfather showed you the baptism scene. 5 murders. Elegant, precise, perfect. The real version: professional gunmen. Prepared ambush. Targets standing right in front of them. They missed every single one. This is the real 5 Families War, and it starts right now. Before we go any deeper, drop your city in the comments right now. Where are you watching from? What time is it? I want to see the Case Files Vault community all over the world in those comments tonight. This is your first video here, hit subscribe right now. Every week we go this deep into the real stories that Hollywood sanitized and history tried to bury. Hit subscribe, give this a like, and share it with someone who thinks The Godfather told them the whole story. Because I promise you, after tonight, they will never watch that film the same way again. To understand how one man's ambition nearly destroyed the most powerful criminal organization in American history, you need to understand what that organization was and what it cost to build. By 1931, Lucky Luciano had done something nobody thought was possible. He had taken a collection of warring ethnic gangs, Sicilian against Neapolitan, old country bosses against American-born operators, family against family, and hammered them into a structure that functioned like a corporation. 5 families, each controlling defined territory in New York City. A commission, a national governing council of the most powerful bosses in the country to settle disputes, prove major decisions, and end the bloody wars that had been killing everyone and bringing federal attention down on all of them. The commission had rules, absolute, non-negotiable rules. You did not kill a made man without commission approval. You did not touch another family's territory without permission. You did not move against a sitting boss. And under no interpretation of any rule that had ever existed in the history of American organized crime did you plot to murder 3 sitting bosses on the same night at the same time. These rules existed because the men who built the commission had lived through what happened without them. The Castellamarys War of 1930 and 1931, 2 years of open warfare in New York. Dozens dead. Politicians embarrassed into action. The entire machine of organized crime ground to a halt, while families killed each other over territory and ego. Luciano understood something that most men around him never fully grasped. The rules were not a cage. The rules were the engine. As long as every family followed them, the system generated more money, more protection, and more influence than any single family could ever produce alone. For almost 30 years, it worked. The 5 families of New York operated like parallel businesses in a cartel. Gambino controlled construction and the waterfront. Lucchese dominated the garment district. Genovese ran loan sharking and gambling. Colombo held the Brooklyn rackets. And Bonanno Joe's family controlled territory stretching from Brooklyn to Montreal to the American Southwest. Each family had its lane. Each family respected the other's lanes. The commission sat above all of it like a Supreme Court ruling on disputes, maintaining the equilibrium that kept everyone rich and safe. It was, in its own deeply criminal way, a functioning system. Then Joe Bonanno looked at everything Luciano had built and decided it was not enough. Joseph Charles Bonanno was born January 18, 1905, in Castellamare del Golfo, a small coastal town in western Sicily that produced, with remarkable consistency, the kind of men who ended up running organized crime in America. His family was not poor. By Sicilian standards, they were aristocratic. Old money, old connections. Blood ties to the Sicilian Mafia stretching back generations. He came to America as a child, returned to Sicily, then came back permanently in 1924 illegally, slipping through Cuba to avoid immigration restrictions. He was 19. He spoke almost no English. And he arrived carrying an absolute conviction that he was born to lead. That was not arrogance in any ordinary sense. It was something deeper and more dangerous. Joe Bonanno genuinely believed that his bloodline, his Castellamarese heritage, his aristocratic Sicilian roots granted him an authority other men simply did not possess. Not smarter, not tougher, a different order of person entirely. By 26, he was the youngest boss in New York. One of the original 5 family heads organized by Luciano in 1931. The man who helped build the very system that would eventually destroy him. For nearly 3 decades, he ran his family with genuine skill, spanned it into Canada when every other boss was still thinking locally. Built operations in Arizona, planting a flag in the Southwest a full generation before anyone else saw its value. Ran a tight, profitable, loyal organization. By any objective measure, one of the most capable organized crime administrators of his generation. But capability and ambition are 2 different things. And Joe Bonanno's ambition had never, not for a single day of his adult life, been satisfied with what he had. He wanted everything. And by the early 1960s, he had convinced himself that history had chosen him specifically to have it. He began making moves other bosses noticed. Quiet conversations with members of other families. Suggestions about restructuring the commission. Proposals that, read carefully, always ended with Bonanno holding more than he started with. The other bosses listened, said nothing, kept watching. And then, sometime in 1963, word filtered through their intelligence networks about something that went far beyond quiet proposals. Joe Bonanno had a plan, and the plan was going to change everything. The disappearance of Joe Bonanno became one of the most extraordinary episodes in the history of American organized crime. His lawyer went public immediately. Bonanno had been kidnapped, taken against his will. The FBI launched a full investigation. Newspapers ran the story for weeks. Was he alive? Would the body surface in a New Jersey car trunk? The answer, which Bonanno eventually admitted in his own memoir, was that he had arranged the entire thing himself. The two men who picked him up on Park Avenue were his own people. They drove him to a safe house in upstate New York. For 19 months, he moved between locations, hidden while his loyalists fought his war on the streets of Brooklyn without him. Consider the audacity of that for a moment. This man had helped create the commission, sat at the table when the rules were written, benefited from those rules for 30 years. Then plotted to murder 3 bosses, been stripped of his organization, been summoned to answer for it, and his response was to fake his own kidnapping and hide in the countryside while other men bled for him. The commission bosses were not just angry. I think we are humiliated in a way that struck at the foundation of everything Luciano had built. The entire institutional process, the tribunal, the proper channels, the mechanism specifically designed to handle a rogue boss without chaos, had been treated by Joe Bonanno as something that simply did not apply to him. If Bonanno could vanish rather than answer to the commission, the rules meant nothing. And if the rules meant nothing, the system that kept all of them safe collapsed. They could not allow that. They gave DeGregorio full authority to bring the Bonanno family under control by any means necessary. And the war ignited. The civil war inside the Bonanno family, which the press called the Banana War, burned from 1964 to 1968. DeGregorio's faction held the majority. The established captains, the men with institutional ties, the ones who understood that backing the commission was the only rational choice. Bonanno's loyalists were fewer but fiercely devoted men who had built their entire careers under Joe directly, whose identities were bound to his. The violence was not spectacular. This was not a war of machine guns and restaurant massacres. It was quieter. Men disappeared. Associates received beatings as warnings. Crews stopped doing business with each other. The economic ecosystem that had made the Bonanno family profitable, the loan sharking operations, the bookmaking networks, the long-distance arrangements with Montreal and Arizona ground down into suspicion and paralysis. What this war produced was not bodies. It produced rot. The slow institutional rot of an organization that had stopped functioning because it was too busy fighting itself to do anything else. And then came January 28, 1966. DeGregorio's faction arranged a meeting. A sit-down, they said. A peace summit on Troutman Street in Bushwick, Brooklyn. A chance to find a path through the conflict. Bonanno's loyalists arrived for a negotiation. They walked into a prepared ambush. Gunmen opened fire. Multiple shooters. Close range, the street erupted. Men ran. Cars sped away. The shooting lasted less than a minute. When the noise stopped and the street went quiet, not one person was dead. Every shooter had missed. Let that land. The DeGregorio faction had selected the location, placed the gunmen, identified the targets, arranged the lure, executed a professional ambush at close range against men who were not expecting it, and hit nobody. The commission's fury was absolute. DeGregorio was replaced as regent immediately. His credibility was gone, his authority shredded. But the damage ran deeper than one man's embarrassment. The ambush that killed nobody had transformed the most serious internal crisis in commission history into something that, at its edges, felt almost farcical. Joe Bonanno, still alive and hidden in upstate New York, was still winning simply by surviving. Every day he drew breath was a failure of the commission's authority. Every morning, DeGregorio's men woke up having still not resolved. This was another morning the rules of the American underworld looked like suggestions rather than laws. The war dragged on for 2 more years. It ended not with a dramatic confrontation, but with exhaustion. The Loyalist faction was too small and too damaged to keep fighting. The Commission faction had the resources, but apparently not the capability to finish it. Both sides had spent 4 years destroying exactly what they were supposedly fighting to control. In May 1966, 19 months after vanishing, Joe Bonanno reappeared. He surrendered to federal authorities rather than face the street. Federal prosecutors charged him with obstruction of justice. He spent the next 3 years fighting the case in courtrooms, staying alive inside the legal system while the war wound down outside it. In 1969, he suffered a genuine heart attack, severe enough that prosecutors eventually dropped the charges on medical grounds. By that point, it no longer mattered. The commission had already done to the Bonanno family what no war could have accomplished. They expelled it entirely from the commission, the only family in the history of the 5 families to receive that punishment. Stripped of representation, cut off from the institutional protection that commission membership provided. The organization Joe Bonanno had spent 30 years building was now affirmed on the formal structure of the American underworld, an outcast. Joe Bonanno retired to Tucson, Arizona. He tended his garden. He wrote his memoir. He told everyone who would listen that he had been wronged. But here's the consequence nobody inside that war fully calculated. The thing that Joe Bonanno's plot, his fake kidnapping, and his 6-year civil war ultimately produced beyond the destruction of his own family was a man who talked. Joseph Valachi had been a soldier in the Genovese crime family his entire adult life. Not a boss, not a captain. A working criminal, the kind of guy who does what he's told, collects what he's owed, and trusts absolutely that the code of silence is the only thing standing between him and a jail cell or a grave. In 1962, sitting in federal prison, Valachi became convinced that Vito Genovese's own boss, a man he had served loyally for decades, had ordered him killed. Whether this belief was accurate or paranoid doesn't really matter. It produced the same result. Valachi went to the FBI and he told them everything. The 5-family structure, the commission, the initiation ritual, the burning card, the pricked finger, the blood oath over a gun and a knife. He laid out the territories, the rules, the names of bosses, captains, and soldiers across every single family in New York. He detailed the specific murders he had witnessed or participated in personally. 30 years of carefully constructed secrecy, delivered to federal investigators by one man who decided his own survival mattered more than his oath. Then, in September 1963, right as Bonanno's plot was unraveling and the commission was stripping him of his family, Joseph Valachi sat before the United States Senate. And he testified on live national television. For the first time in American history, a made member of La Cosa Nostra confirmed publicly, under oath, on camera, that the organization existed, that it had rules, that it had a governing structure, that it had been running inside American cities, corrupting American institutions, for 3 full decades. J. Edgar Hoover had spent 20 years publicly insisting the American Mafia was a myth. Why? Partly because acknowledging it would mean admitting how thoroughly it had penetrated the very institutions the FBI was supposed to be protecting. The commission had spent 30 years hiding behind front companies, corrupt officials, and the absolute reliability of omerta, the code of silence that made prosecution nearly impossible. All of it rested on one single assumption that no insider would ever talk. Valachi talked. The hearings ran for weeks. It was all over live television. Newspapers printed the full transcripts. Ordinary Americans sitting in their living rooms were learning that the organization they had maybe suspected existed was real, was national, and was deeply embedded in their city's political systems, had been since before most of them were born. Now, here is the connection that almost every mainstream account misses. The Bonanno War created Valachi's testimony. Not with a direct line you could draw in a courtroom, but the chaos and paranoia that Joe Bonanno's plot unleashed had seeped through every single level of the organization. Men who had spent their lives certain that loyalty was the only currency that mattered were now watching bosses betray bosses and families turn on themselves. Valachi, sitting in his federal prison cell, watched all of it unfold. And the calculation he made that the organization could no longer be trusted to protect him that Genovese had already decided he was disposable, That silence was no longer his best option. It's a calculation shaped by what the Banana War had done to the very idea of mob loyalty. Joe Bonanno cracked something that went far deeper than just his own family. He cracked the foundational psychological contract the entire organization ran on, the belief that the rules held, that loyalty was rewarded, and that the institution protected those who protected it. Once that crack appeared, a man like Valachi was simply inevitable. Thanks for watching. If you found this story as fascinating as I did, make sure to hit that subscribe button for more deep dives into history's hidden connections. See you next time. The Godfather gives you Michael Corleone at the baptism. 5 murders, 5 locations. Perfect coordination. The new dawn consolidating power in a single flawless afternoon while organ. Music plays, and a priest asks him if he renounces Satan. It is one of the greatest sequences in cinema history. Ruthless, elegant, almost beautiful in its precision. Here is what the movie does not show you. The real attempt to seize power through simultaneous murder was not elegant. It was not precise. The plan was conceived by a 60-year-old man so completely sealed inside his own sense of historical destiny that he could not see what every other boss in America saw the moment they heard about it, that it was insane, that it would never work, and that the attempt alone would cost him everything he had spent 30 years building. The Godfather gives you Michael's baptism as the defining image of how organized crime consolidates power. The real defining image of the Five Families War is a group of professional gunmen on Troutman Street, Brooklyn, firing at unarmed men at close range in a prepared kill zone, missing every single one of them. That is the real Five Families War, not baptism music and perfect choreography. A civil war that produced 4 years of organizational rot, a retired boss, tending a garden in Arizona and writing a memoir full of self-justifications, and a loyal soldier sitting in a Senate chamber dismantling 30 years of mob secrecy in an afternoon. The movie made the consolidation of power look like genius. The reality showed that when one man's ego collides with an institution specifically built to stop men like him, the result is not a baptism scene. It is a missed ambush, an empty safe house, and the slow collapse of everything. When the Banana War finally exhausted itself in 1968, Joe Bonanno was already in Arizona. He had surrendered to federal authorities in May 1966, used the courts as a shield against the street, fought the obstruction charges for 3 years, and walked free in 1969 after his heart attack made the prosecution untenable. By then, the war was over. The family was expelled from the commission. The loyalists were scattered. Bonanno settled in Tucson. He built a quiet life in the desert. Garden grandchildren golf, the measured routines of a man who had survived everything the American underworld could throw at him, and emerged on the other side with his health and his freedom, if not his empire. In 1983, he published his memoir, A Man of Honor. It was exactly what you would expect from a man who had spent 20 years constructing a personal mythology. He presented himself throughout as a misunderstood patriarch, a man of principle surrounded by lesser men who had failed to honor his vision. The plot against the 3 bosses described vaguely, stripped of its most damning details, framed as a defensive maneuver forced upon him by enemies. The fake kidnapping presented as a calculated strategy rather than a desperate flight from a death sentence. He never admitted he had been wrong, not once, not about any of it. He lived to be 97 years old. He died on May 11, 2002, in Tucson, in his own home, surrounded by his family. The man who had plotted to murder 3 sitting commission bosses, faked his own kidnapping, started a 6-year civil war, helped trigger the Senate testimony that handed the federal government its first real map of organized crime, and watched his family, expelled from the commission, died peacefully in the desert. For decades removed from the world he had helped build and helped destroy. Still convinced, until his last breath, that history had simply failed to recognize him correctly. When the Banana War finally exhausted itself in 1968, Joe Bonanno was already in Arizona. He had surrendered to federal authorities in May 1966, used the courts as a shield against the street, fought the obstruction charges for 3 years, and walked free in 1969 after his heart attack made the prosecution untenable. By then, the war was over. The family was expelled from the commission. The loyalists were scattered. Bonanno settled in Tucson. He built a quiet life in the desert. Garden grandchildren golf, the measured routines of a man who had survived everything the American underworld could throw at him, and emerged on the other side with his health and his freedom, if not his empire. In 1983, he published his memoir, A Man of Honor. It was exactly what you would expect from a man who had spent 20 years constructing a personal mythology. He presented himself throughout as a misunderstood patriarch, a man of principle surrounded by lesser men who had failed to honor his vision. The plot against the three bosses described vaguely, stripped of its most damning details, framed as a defensive maneuver forced upon him by enemies. The fake kidnapping presented as a calculated strategy rather than a desperate flight from a death sentence. He never admitted he had been wrong, not once, not about any of it. He lived to be 97 years old. He died on May 11, 2002, in Tucson, in his own home, surrounded by his family. The man who had plotted to murder 3 sitting commission bosses, faked his own kidnapping, started a 6-year civil war, helped trigger the Senate testimony that handed the federal government its first real map of organized crime, and watched his family, expelled from the commission, died peacefully in the desert. For decades removed from the world he had helped build and helped destroy. Still convinced, until his last breath, that history had simply failed to recognize him correctly.
Here is what the 5 families' war was actually about beneath all the missed gunshots and Senate hearings and desert retirements. It was about the impossible contradiction at the heart of every criminal organization that has ever tried to build lasting institutions. To build a criminal empire, you need men who are genuinely dangerous. Every senator who sat in that subcommittee chamber, listening to Valachi, understood they were hearing things that should have been known and acted upon decades earlier. The Mafia had been hiding in plain sight in American cities for 30 years. It had corrupted police departments, court systems, labor unions, and political machines in every major city in the country. It was a 60-year-old man's fatal collision between his sense of destiny and an institution specifically designed to stop men exactly like him, and the 30-year chain of consequences that collision set in motion for every family, every boss, and every man who had ever sat at the commission's table.
The Godfather gave you Michael Corleone, making perfect decisions in perfect silence. The reality gave you professional gunmen missing every target at close range. A mob boss staging his own kidnapping and hiding in upstate New York for 19 months. A loyal soldier dismantling 30 years of organized crime secrecy. In a Senate hearing room while the entire country watched live on television. The real story is always stranger, darker, and more human than anything Hollywood dares to put on screen. If this video kept you locked in from that first scene on Park Avenue all the way to this moment, subscribe to the Case Files Vault right now. Every week we go past the myth, past the movie, past the version everyone already thinks they know, and we show you what was actually there. Hit subscribe, turn on notifications, give this video a like, and drop a comment below. Did you know the professional ambush on Troutman Street missed every single target? Does knowing the real story change how you see The Godfather? Tell me below. I read every one. The Case Files Vault. The truth is always more dangerous than the legend.